Today we're joined by Dominique Lamb, former Queensland Small Business Commissioner, where she worked with thousands of small businesses, helping them navigate real challenges. And now, Director of Community Affairs for the Brisbane 2032 Olympic and Paralympic Games, she sits at the intersection of government, community, and one of the biggest global events that Australia will host. This isn't a conversation about business. It's about leadership. It's about navigating complexity. And it's about understanding the realities behind the titles that people see. If you're building a business, leading a team, or trying to step into bigger rooms, then this episode will challenge how you think about leadership and growth. Over 90% of people that watch the show aren't actually subscribed, and we release conversations like this every single week. If you're serious about building predictable revenue for your B2B business, then make sure you subscribe to the podcast. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. A lot of people see where you are now and the different roles that you've been in. So do you want to take us through that little bit journey of how you got to where you are?
Definitely. I think I like to start back quite far. I grew up in a family where my mother had migrated from Holland with her parents. They had 3 children in Holland and they had a 4th in Australia. And I guess this was sort of in Western Sydney, and my mum worked a lot. So she worked in retail, and I was academically quite bright, so particularly around English and debating and public speaking and things like that. And I decided quite early on that I wanted to help people. And so like most people that want to help people, and if they've got certain academics, they either end up becoming a doctor or a lawyer, and I went down the path of becoming a lawyer. So I started out as a building and construction lawyer, interestingly enough, and then moved over to become an employment lawyer or an industrial relations lawyer. So I did lots of work with employer associations and employer unions, really loved understanding and hearing people's stories. And I used to joke it was a little bit like counselling, like, these managers would ring up and say, I've got this problem, I've got these people and they're doing these things. And, I would work through that process with them. And from there, I talk about how I accidentally became a CEO. And so I was working in a legal practice, in private practice, and a friend of mine rang and said, hey, there's this role going as at, the National Retail Association as the head of legal. And I said, I'm probably too junior for that. You should find somebody else. And he was like, no, I think you should meet with them. You've got nothing to lose. Just have a conversation. And so I had this conversation with the CEO at the time and the chair, and took this role that was, in my mind, so large. It had a team. I was a principal in a practice, so I looked after all of the lawyers for them. And I also needed to sort of build work and, make sure that you can feed all your baby lawyers and things like that. From there, about 12 months in, the board came to me again because our CEO got pre-selected to federal politics, and they said, we think you should become the CEO. It's too early, but you won't do it without friends. And so I was like, oh, well, I still think you should find someone else, but let's give this a go. And so I took the role, and 7 years later, I was still there. When you transition from, a profession like being a lawyer, your skills change. And my skills had, really evolved. I was doing a lot more media, a lot more advocacy, a lot more work with government and managing stakeholders, and then just the fundamentals of business, whether that was, looking at finances or marketing and events. I really, really wanted, so the dream role was to be appointed as a statutory appointment to a commission or something like that. As most young lawyers, you sort of look up to judges and commissioners and things like that. And the Small Business Commissioner role came up in Queensland, and I applied, and I was successful in that. And I guess it was the dream job, right? So I took the dream job, and I was really lucky that I was in the role for about 3 years, and I got to look after 495,000 small businesses across Queensland and help them with everything from, bad debts to business disputes to leasing and tenancy claims, and then also to advocate on their behalf to government at all levels to make sure they got a better outcome. And I loved that job. It was the dream job. And then from there, what happens with those roles is they're tenured. So I was there for a period of 3 years, and I decided at the end of my 3 years that I would move on. And now I find myself at Brisbane 2032 looking after community affairs. So it's been a really long journey and a very varied journey. as well, but mainly because I said yes at lots of different intersections where I could have said no.
Yeah. There was lots of opportunities that
Yeah.
you took.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it's terrified in all of those junctures, but took them anyway.
Was there any defining moments throughout that journey that shaped your career?
Oh, so many defining moments. I think fundamentally I wouldn't be where I am and I wouldn't have taken those roles had it not been for certain people. And at the time, there was a chair as part of the National Retail Association who'd been there for about 21 years, a very well-known gentleman that really shaped and guided my development. And what was really interesting about that, if you consider it as a mentoring relationship, is that our styles were almost completely opposite. And so the relationship itself and the process of him, I guess, teaching me and guiding me and growing my skills was very unpleasant for me. Like, I found it really uncomfortable. However, I can't tell you how, like, when when obviously not in the same roles anymore, but I look back on all of those lessons and the way that they've shaped my decision making has been so pivotal in the success of my other roles. And I'm so grateful for those lessons because, without them, I wouldn't think of things the same way.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's not many days that I don't think, what would Mark do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was there any moments throughout that journey as well where you were like, oh my God, am I doing the right thing? Am I on the right path?
Oh,
Am I
so
going
many.
the right direction?
Yeah, absolutely. Almost on a daily basis. I always joke about regretting my life decisions. And it's true. Like, I have definitely had so many days where I think, as you say, people look at people like me and they think, wow, you must have worked really hard or got really amazing marks or done all these, made all these right decisions and therefore you're in the positions that you're in. But I think what people don't talk about is the toxicity that sits at the top of that, especially if you are a little bit different or you approach things differently or if you're younger or really if you have any of those sort of discriminatory markers, people look at it differently and you do stand out. And the pressure to stay at the top and to be successful and to remain successful is a lot. And I think there are many days where I've thought, oh, is this the right decision for me? I think some of those particular times, if I think back to examples of, what were those times, I had an experience where when I was the CEO of the National Retail Association, there were two industry bodies in the same industry. And we had a really aggressive competitor. And this is sort of not dissimilar if you're in business, if you've got, a really similar brand to yours, right in your sort of niche market, that your marketing's very similar. It's hard to tell you apart. Like, some of you might be in a certain state, but not in others. And even differentiating, like, what your point of difference can be quite different. And you all sort of purport to do the same thing. But I had this really aggressive competitor that started a very public campaign in terms of discrediting me. And so for about the course of 2 years, every 2 weeks, there would be a new article that specifically referred to something. And in many respects, a lot of them weren't true. At one point, they leaked the date of the birth of my second child to the Australian Financial Review. There was all of these moments, and there was this sort of like white anting type scenario where I'd, go into rooms and things were said that weren't accurate. And I think if you are really morally or values driven, it can be very difficult, not to constantly be in defense.
Yeah.
And I was lucky in that there's no doubt that at those times I was really thinking, like, what have I done? And am I doing the right thing? And is this where I should be? And there's certainly pressure to give up, right? Like that would have served them, right? Like, they would have got what they wanted. I would have been out of the way. It would have disadvantaged the other business. And I remember at the time, again, doing things a little bit differently, but it was in the height of COVID. And industry bodies can often be quite competitive around memberships. where you're getting your business, things like that. And I created almost like a consortium where we would all work together on certain issues that we could agree on, whether that was safety, whether it was, abuse towards retail workers, whether that was the leasing code. There were things that we could agree on. And in fact, it was that consortium and that sort of trusted group of colleagues that when things were said and when things were published that weren't true, were the first to defend me. And having a coalition of people that knew that I did what I said I was going to do, that knew, what was happening around, like sort of in this noise, was really grounding. And I think that's really ultimately how I navigated that space. It was because of those people.
So did those like high pressure moments where, you're going through 2 years of being targeted, I guess, like did that take a toll on your mental health?
Absolutely. I think at the time I didn't know. Like I'm one of those people that pushes and pushes and pushes through, and probably not unlike most business owners in that sort of extreme personality type scenario, and I felt the weight and the responsibility of the people that I worked with and the people that I was employing as the CEO of that business. And I, really sort of felt that weight. And I think, it did get to a point where I knew that my time was up. Like I do think that in any business, your senior leadership team has a shelf life and they're normally there to do something particular, and you need a certain set of leaders in a business to get to where you want to go. And so for me, I knew that I was the person that was good with the difficult stakeholders. I knew that I was the person that could sort of navigate certain arenas better than others. I knew that I was bipartisan. And so from a government perspective, I sat right in the middle, which of course our previous CEO had been pre-selected, picked a side. So there's always that sort of taint on a business after something like that happens. But I also knew that there were others that would have bigger and better ideas and that would be more innovative and that would do different things. And I think by the time I got to the end of my tenure, I think I stayed probably about 18 months too long. I think I should have done 5 and not 7. But it was difficult to get out, because of the responsibility and the things that are happening and distractions, right? Like, like COVID, for instance.
Yeah. I think COVID took a big toll on everyone
Yeah.
and businesses as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So you've worked with thousands of businesses, as you mentioned, like
495,000 in Queensland.
Yeah, that's a huge number. Now, you've seen what actually happens behind the scenes. You've seen all the struggles that they go through. What are the most challenging things that small business owners are going through?
Oh, look, I think that it's pretty tough out there right now. I think economically it is hard. Now, there's a few reasons for that. About 80% of all business finance is attached to home loans. So wherever there is interest rate increases, business owners are wearing the brunt of that. And there's not a lot of levers that are being pulled or have been pulled in recent years to alleviate some of those pains. So, where we've seen like electricity rebates and things like that, they're never as high for your sort of small business owners as they are for, say, individuals. So the individuals definitely get them. And of course, in many respects, small businesses can be individuals, but the alleviating of their costs has been hard and not quite there. I think that costs generally across the board have gone up exponentially in sort of unprecedented ways, and not just now with an emerging war and fuel prices, but before that, whether that was energy, whether it was insurance, no matter what it was. I also think that in Australia, there is a real differentiation between financial literacy and tax literacy. I think our tax literacy is significantly lower than our financial literacy. So when I look at the insolvency rates and I see where they're coming from, a lot of it is unpaid tax debt. And the prevalence of the ATO to go and retrieve that tax debt from small business, which is their prerogative as a regulator, and they're doing it within their guidelines. I think what's not understood, especially in a country and a state like Queensland, is how big we are. And so where you go and you retrieve tax debt from a small business in South Queensland, they might bounce back, right? Like if they can't pay it and they shut their doors and they become insolvent, you'll get a replacement in a couple of weeks. Where you do that in somewhere like Sargaminda in Queensland, they might not come back for 2 generations. And I think the impacts of some of these decisions that we're making from a policy perspective are really profound. But the people that are wearing them are our small business owners. And I think what's really sad about that and the pressures that are on small business owners is that young people watch it, and they're probably more astute than our generations. But we know that now less than 8% of under 30s are starting their own business, which means we have a succession planning problem. So we'll get to a point where, we may not have anyone that wants to take on these roles. And I think for our regional, remote and rural friends, that has got far greater impacts than what we'll see in the southeast.
Yeah, wow. So I guess you've just explained my next question, which was the real reason most businesses struggle. And obviously that would be the...
I think there's a few things. Like, it's definitely pressure too, right? So for most small business owners, it's exceptionally lonely. Most people will start a business because they love something. Like we always used to joke about, Sam that has a surfboard store. It's because Sam likes surfing. It's not because he's particularly enamored with the ATO and HR and social media and all the other things that he has to do, right? He's good at surfboards. That's why he's there. And so I think people get into business because they want to do what they love, and that at its core is what it should be. But when you're in it on your own, I think by nature as Australians, we're not particularly good at asking for help. We're really good at giving help. We'll support everyone around us, but we're not great at saying, I don't understand, or I need assistance. Or sometimes the cost of getting assistance seems like it is too much. So I think, why they're struggling is because they are a bit isolated. And I do think that, it's the networkers. And in fact, I know because we commissioned a behavioural study while I was at the Queensland Small Business Commissioner's office about small business owners. And it was the first of its kind in 20 years. And it showed that small businesses that had a network, that lent on other people, that could, had visibility over their finances, whether that was a spreadsheet or whether that was Mile or Xero or QuickBooks, did better. But it was fundamentally the networks because they felt comfortable enough to ask for help.
Yeah. And do you feel like when they're not asking for that help, it comes from a place of like shame or maybe...
Yeah. I think people are really proud of their business. I think they're so proud of what they've built. And also I think there's a lot of pressure on them to be successful. It's a bit like everyone right now, right? You've got to exercise every day. You should be meditating. You should do your gratitude journal. You got to eat healthy. Don't drink too much coffee. Make sure you go to sleep. Stick some tape on your nose so that you can breathe. Like you name it, we all have to do it, right? Like don't yell at your kids. Yell at your kids. Like the pressure and I guess the overwhelm of our senses is so profound that they don't, there's just so much out there. I'm not sure they know where to go or where it would be safe to go or what the right decision is. And I think that sort of fawning behaviour can really create a far worse situation than if you just lean into the painful sometimes.
We've seen this significantly moving from obviously like Scotland to here. In Scotland, people are a lot more proactive, maybe in the sense that, they're going to be like, okay, I need to get this person involved. I need to get this person involved. And it takes a village to grow anything, to do a lot of things in life. So yeah, when people come to us for marketing, usually it's a case of, oh, this person down the road said, I need to do this without actually knowing. And a lot, like you said, everybody goes in business because they have a passion for it, because they love what they do. And then it's a case of, okay, now I run this business. I need to understand marketing. I need to understand taxes. I need to understand, saving money so that I can invest in my business. And one thing we see since moving to Australia is business owners are scared to invest because they don't see the return on investment.
Immediately.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's that instant gratification. It's funny because if you sort of map the successful, like old family retailers across the country that own their buildings.
Yeah.
Right? And it's good because it sits really well on your balance sheet and, you can write off certain things and you can lease it out, you can do all sorts of stuff with an asset. And I think that sometimes we forget about that as business owners. It's that investment component that is critical not only to the ability to scale, but even to diversifying your income streams.
Yeah.
And so, if you consider, I used to talk about this when I was in retail, but the businesses that were able to diversify their incomes, whether that was through a subscription model or an experience or, your stock standard sort of sale of goods, they were the ones that were successful because it was about hedging your bets. And that's interestingly what you see in regional, remote and rural Queensland is that often the business owners are more sophisticated because they invest. And so they will, they'll have 3 businesses because they know that, when it's drought, the farm's not going to do well, but the social media business will because everybody will be trying to get more business. Yeah. So they look at like what are the ways to do it, and it comes from necessity, but in actual fact, it's the diversification of income that works.
Yeah, and it's always having that backup, I guess, if you're just focusing on one source of income and that income blows, you're done.
Exactly.
What else do you do? So if you have those multiple incomes and you lose one, then you can fall back on the other while you're fixing
this one over here. That's right.
Yeah. So what patterns do you see in small business owners that happen over and over and over again?
Probably a failure to lean in early enough. So they often won't talk about a problem that they're experiencing until it's far too late. Yeah. So not getting help early, not truly understanding their balance sheets, so not understanding, what their assets and liabilities are. I have also sort of observed small business owners to probably struggle around letting go of a business, so like having to control a business, so they fail to succession plan because the control element is there. Yeah. But I think one of the biggest issues is also, and it's funny because I had the pleasure of interviewing the lady that started Boost Juice, and I asked her, what's the one piece of advice you would give a business owner or the business owners in this audience? And she said to hire an EA, because if someone could give you 20% back in your day and you could then in turn do all the things that you're avoiding, you would get a better outcome. And I think that's a real lesson. Like there's this view that you have to do everything and that you're the only person that can do it. Well, that's not true, right? Everybody's replaceable. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, look, I think they are typically the patterns that you see in small business owners.
Yeah. I would 100% agree that with the letting go part, when we're scaling businesses and, when you get to a certain point, you need to fall back on, your team. You should have the people that you have in your team should be smarter than you at whatever they're doing in their business. You should have those team players that are coming on to help you grow the business. But it really is that, letting go, letting somebody else have control of that part and focusing on what really matters to help drive growth for the business. Yeah. It's tough. So for the small business owners that are listening, what would you tell them to focus on?
Oh, look, you're 80% less likely to be insolvent if you actually have visibility over your finances. Yeah. So if you're not using MyOb, Xero or QuickBooks, you need to immediately, and pay a good bookkeeper or accountant. That is fundamentally the best piece of advice I could give any business, is that to understand your financial position.
For all the listeners, make sure you're focusing on this. Cool. So something I wanted to explore and talk on is being a woman in a high level position, because there's the reality and then there's also the narrative that people portray with that. So from your experience, is the game different from being a woman to a man?
I think it's an interesting question, because I think over time my answer has changed. Yeah. But yes, I think fundamentally it is different. I think the expectations are different. And typically, depending on the industry that you're in, it will be because of, whether or not you stand out or not. I think there is this rhetoric around it being the same, and I don't think it is. If you consider equity, where we want people to sort of, if you consider a race, you want them to start at the same start line. I don't think women start at the same start line. And I don't think that, our other friends, whether they're, racially different or their sexuality is different or their religion is different, start in the same place either. And so I do think that there are some fundamental differences being a woman in business.
Yeah, I would 100% agree. One thing I see, obviously working with my dad, I don't know if this stems from being younger, and obviously like I'm still learning a lot, but we'll have some people that might come to us for strategic advice. I'll give the advice and then they'll go and ask the same question to my dad, who will reiterate exactly what I've just said, but they'll agree with him or me. I don't know if that stems from being a woman or whether that stems from being young. Maybe a bit of both.
It could be. Yes. I mean, look, it is absolutely true. And I think it's hard with brands because, sometimes people do default to whoever the brand's persona is attached to, which could be your dad. But in the alternative, I mean, most likely it is because you are young, and possibly because you're female, depending on the person's unconscious bias that is asking the question again. Yeah. And it's hard to tell, right? Like it's hard to tell which one it is, but at the end of the day, it will be unconscious bias, that leads them to ask the question again or to not have the trust and rapport.
Yeah. So do you think women are judged differently when they're in those high leadership roles compared to men?
Yes, I do. I think they are judged differently. I think there are a number of books out there written. There's so many books out there written about this, but I think that unfortunately for many women in positions of leadership, they fall into, 4 categories. And normally that's either they're a battle axe and they're too hard, or they're a mother. So they're mothering everyone around them and, leaving themselves to last. There is also this sort of concept of like the tart or the whore that comes up, I think, for women as well. And then, between those sort of personas, I think it's just how women are typically labelled. I mean, even in my own career, like the number of times that I've heard things said about me, including, whether or not my success of being around other male-led successful brands has been because they enjoy having attractive women around them. Like, we all have a story about those things. And I think, no matter sort of where you come from, how long you've been there, what your credentials are, there is inherently a different treatment of women in leadership roles. And I think even by other women. So sometimes expectations are higher, around, how do you present, what people might comment on, how they might network with you, where you're most likely to get your roles. If you do too well, what does that mean, and the things that are said about you doing particularly well. I mean, God forbid that a woman gets somewhere because of her hard work, right? Like, I think it's better, but I do think there is an element of a glass ceiling in certain realms.
Yeah, I'd agree. It's definitely better than what it used to be. But yeah, I do agree that I've had quite a lot of comments on, my appearance and all this sort of stuff that men have tried to advance on, I guess, which is disgusting and, in my preference. But I think it is harder being a woman in business than it is a man.
Yeah, I mean, I think also, it comes back to that unconscious bias, right? So if we consider that the majority of men will hold board positions and they'll be of a certain age, the truth is that you need 7 diversity mindsets to get a 20% better outcome. That's not just women, that's, sort of different ages and sexes and religions and all those things. But if people don't get a seat at the table, then the 20% is unachievable.
Yeah.
But I think also, men have been networking together for a really long time. They share information differently. Even if we consider that from a youth perspective, they play differently. Like they're taught to win and that it's okay to win. Yeah. Girls are taught to collaborate. And so our approach and I guess comfort level around, how to interact in business is greatly shaped by that, right? And women are judged for it, right? I mean, I have a very close friend of mine who is a partner of a law firm, and she doesn't have any children. And, she's judged because she doesn't have children. But if she did have children, she'd be judged conversely anyway, right? Like, so you can't actually win.
No.
And in saying that, I mean, I know many of my sort of male colleagues would say for themselves that it's difficult being male in this market at a time where they feel like they could say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing and it would be inadvertent and they don't mean anything by it. But it's sort of these microaggressions that, everybody's trying to navigate.
Yeah.
And it's sort of not about jumping on them, but also just understanding probably from a civility perspective how it might make someone feel and also meeting people where they're at, right? So, if I've had a particularly terrible experience in my last employer, then my view about things that you say may be heightened because of my experience. But having enough sort of maturity to have these open discussions without it becoming, one person versus another is really important.
Yeah, 100%. Is there anything that women go through that you think men might not even be aware of?
I had a really interesting experience where I was working with a business that was using virtual reality to teach unconscious bias. And part of that was that they put the virtual reality goggles on you, and then they put you into workplace scenarios. And what came out was that the men that would put on the goggles had no idea the impact of being the shortest person in a group. And so it was the first time they'd experienced having, all of these other men around them as a woman, but having them sort of over the top of them because they were the shortest person in a room. And that sounds really silly, right? But just the distinction around what it might look like to be the only woman to walk into a boardroom and then to have a group of men that have known each other for a really long time. Maybe they went to school together. Maybe they row together. Maybe they've got common interests that are completely separate from yours.
Yeah.
And you might be the primary caregiver of your children and possibly your elderly parents, and you're still doing a job, and you're still held to a different standard because of whatever preconceptions the group might have about you. So then the perception is you come off aggressive or you come off as whatever it is, right? And I think that's getting better. I don't think it's in every boardroom. But I also think that unless you hold one of those adversity markers or just discrimination markers, if you want to call them that, then you don't get that experience. And it's funny because there's a really well-known judge in Australia called Justice Kirby, and when he was on the High Court of Australia, he was the only homosexual male, and Justice Galdron at the time was the only woman. And when you look at the judgments, they both dissented in the same way, but they were good friends because they were the only two people that truly understood what it was like to be discriminated against, right? I don't think everything comes down to discrimination, but I do think that experiences are worn by the person that has them, and that perception shapes how they interact with the world, right? So if you're in a room of all of the same type of people, of course, they're going to walk in lockstep.
Yeah.
And, and that's where sort of all these champions of change and things like that have come from, because it's not that we need to be saved, but acknowledgement of that inequity is really important.
Yeah. So for any women that are listening to the podcast right now, what's some advice that you would give them about leadership, about, getting into these high level roles?
You have to take the opportunity. Ultimately, it comes down to just fake it till you make it, right? I mean, we know this about resumes, and we know this about, the difference between how much criteria men will meet before they'll apply for a job versus women.
Yeah.
Just take the job. Just say yes to the opportunity and work it out later. I also think it's really essential for anyone to get your own group of cheerleaders and to understand what your values are. Once you understand what your values are, just remember to hold yourself accountable to that standard. It's not about other people's standard. It's about your standard. And use those cheerleaders as your sounding board, because I think that you need people that you can call on your worst day, but they need to be the same people that you can call on your best day, and you'll get, that support. And I think having that is absolutely critical, especially for young women making the decision to take the next step or to take a leadership role. All of the sort of studies show that what is actually critical is the mentorship at the time.
Yeah.
And try and find a mentor that's not like you,
Yeah.
that's going to make you a little bit uncomfortable and think differently.
There's so much growth in discomfort. Well, you might feel like dumb, or you might feel stupid, or whatever you might feel, you'll come out the other end thanking them for that. Cool. So you now moved on to your new role at the Brisbane 2032 Olympic and Paralympic Games. So what does your role actually involve in day-to-day?
So I interestingly work for Andrew Liveris in the President's office, and I look after all community engagement across Queensland, nationally, and at the moment into Oceania, until we get some more help internally around that. And so what that looks like is engaging at the moment with our host cities and our local government areas around what the Games will mean for Queensland in the verticals of school-age kids from 5 to 25, SMEs around things like procurement, and then in time it will be our sporting clubs once the sports program is set.
Yeah, cool. So what opportunities does this create for businesses?
Yeah, look, there's huge amounts of opportunity. And I think what's really interesting is that we need to know where to go. So Brisbane 2032 is the organising committee, or the OCOG, within Queensland. And we look after certain amounts of procurement, but we ultimately put on the show. So everything from the opening and closing ceremonies, the program, with the sport, security, looking after the athletes. Athletes are always at the centre of everything that we do, whether that's the villages, feeding them uniforms, linen, washing facilities, you name it. So to give you an example, we will need 400 washing machines, about 5,600 traffic cones, 6,000 whistles. Like, these are big numbers. It's a mega event. But to put on a mega event, we don't do that in isolation. So we also work with the state government, the federal government, and then the local government areas. So to be in the mix around procurement, you want to be on local buy, you need to be on vendor panel, and then we have our own procurement portal called the ICN Gateway. Now, the beauty of the OCOG's procurement is that you can partially register. So you don't have to be able to do the whole expression of interest, you can just do part of it. And you can register for that part, or you can register for the whole thing. And so what I would say is, as a mega event, supply chain is incredibly important. But what we will do with small businesses is put them into consortiums so that they can be competitive. You can also form your own consortium with other small businesses before you register, which is really helpful for us. And it's really about showcasing what Australian and Queensland businesses have to offer. If I consider Paris, their procurement involved about 83% of French businesses and 86% of SMEs. So it is absolutely possible, and we would hope to do better.
Yep. So for businesses that want to, get involved in this, what can they start doing now to prepare for that?
Yep. So come along to our website, go to Brisbane 2032 and register against the ICN Gateway so that you get those updates about the expressions of interest. Yep. There's about 65 of them up there right now. And I think we've had close to 2,000 that have already been up there, and that will continue. So make sure that you are looking and registering. But if you're with Vendor Panel already, we're also on there too. So you'll be able to see what those contracts look like.
Cool. So what needs to happen between now and 2032 for it to be successful?
Yes.
Because this, like you said, this is a huge event and massive for Brisbane.
Yes. I mean, lots of things have to happen. We have a very large contract with the IOC that we have to deliver. But you would have heard lots about venues being built. So the state government builds the stage, and then we take the stage and put on the venues. So I think the big crucial rocks right now are that, emblems will come out this year. A sports program will be announced towards the back end of the year. From there, we then see like where are those venues? And then once LA 2028 hits, it's a really fast runway into Brisbane 2032. So lots to do. Obviously, mascots is something we get hit up about. There's medals, there's uniforms. All of those things have to be procured and also coordinated alongside our national federations, the Australian Olympic Committee and Paralympics Australia. But I guess the best part of everything I've observed is just how well all the stakeholders are working together and how coordinated it is here versus what I've sort of observed in other places.
Yeah, that's really exciting to hear. I think this is going to be a really good event for Brisbane and Australia as a whole.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome. So we're going to go to leadership pressure and decision making. So how has your definition of leadership changed over time throughout all your careers?
I think that I have grown to really appreciate good leaders and different leaders that choose to do things a little bit differently. I think human capital is by far probably the most valuable asset in any business. And it's the leaders that have used the right amount of data and measurables against the value of that human capital and the investment in the human capital that I've seen get the best outcomes.
Yeah, I'd agree. The leader either makes or breaks you, in my opinion. Yes. Yeah, you either flourish or
it's not for you. Yeah, that's right.
You move on to the next thing. So what does good leadership actually look like in your...
Yes. So good leadership looks like a person that can create a safe and secure environment where your people can come and tell you when they're having their worst day and when they're having their best day. It is someone who is flexible enough to ebb and flow with the human condition, but also to get the best out of those people by really uniquely tailoring their approach to those individuals.
Yeah. Wow, that was such a a great explanation of...
I love that sort of human capital component. It's probably the old industrial relations lawyer in me, but they are the best places to work, right? Where the teams get along really well and they back each other in, and they're, led by somebody that truly cares about the well-being of their team and where they're going, and people buy into where we're going based on loyalty to that leader. And it's reciprocal. It's not a one-way street where they're constantly demanding of you something and you get nothing in return. It's investment. And I think, that's the critical part.
Yeah. This is going to be a little bit off
that's okay.
What we're going from. But because obviously you mentioned human connection, I would love to know your views on AI.
Oh, yeah.
Into businesses.
Yeah, I think AI is something that gives people time back, which ultimately gives them human connection. Yeah. I think it's about how we use our time. Yeah. So I think that AI has its place. I think it can only do certain things right now, albeit, close, if not better, to some of the things that humans can do. But I think it's a time-saving tool. Yeah. I think it's been around for a long time. Yes, it's a revolution, but it's about not getting sucked into the noise and using it for to right size it for your business.
Yeah. What do you think about the whole layoffs with replacing humans with AI?
I don't think that will happen. Yeah. I think that obviously there are certain jobs where, that could be the case. But I think like anything, there's a lot of fear mongering that happens around, I remember when everyone said that self-serve checkouts were going to be the end of retail and that all the workers would be sacked, and they were not sacked, and they were, moved around to do different things in the business. And even now we see people on checkouts because people want human connection, right? I think ultimately it's about, what is best for the business. AI serves a purpose for sure. Is it always going to get it right? No, it's not. Do people still look for humans and want to, talk to someone about customer service and talk to an actual human and not talk to a bot? Yes, they do. So I think whilst there will be, certainly a bit of a shift around numbers that we employ and what that looks like, ultimately there will be roles for these people whether it's in that role or if it's in something that's diversified or if it's just a little bit easier.
I think when you were looking at AI, it can get a lot of that donkey work done, that low level kind of stuff that might be very time consuming. But yeah, there's always going to be a space for people. And I agree with you. I actually did a LinkedIn post the other day because on LinkedIn, I've actually seen a lot of people, there's been a lot of like AI posts on LinkedIn, right? And LinkedIn's always been very performative in a sense. But I've seen a lot of memes just posted or relatable, funny stuff. And the post like engagement is just through the roof compared to like, normal educational stuff. But it's because it's creating that emotional human connection.
Exactly. And I think, it didn't get there on its own either. Like it needed some human connection in order to form its views.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. So how do you handle pressure when the stakes are high?
So for me, it comes back to values. And so I sort of have a bit of a regular process that I go through whereby I set 5 values that I would like to be known for and that I would like to emulate in my life, and they change. And I hold myself accountable to those values, particularly in times of stress. So things like I ask myself questions like, would a calm person react this way? Would a kind person react this way? Would a determined person, hit snooze on their alarm? Like all of those kinds of things. The other thing that I do, the more stressed I get, the more I run. So I find, and look, some people meditate. I find that running for long lengths of time creates the same sort of mental reaction for me in that it sort of quietens the noise, it gets rid of excessive anxious energy. It allows me to clearly think and it puts me back in a state of calm. So I think everyone needs a process, but for me that's the process.
Yeah. Well, they always say when you're in that state of stress or anger or you're stuck is to step away and do something for yourself. Yeah. Cool. So the next one, what has been the hardest part about stepping into the big high level roles?
I think that there is a perception that when you step into big high level roles that people will know what they're doing. And that is not the case. The number of teams that I have walked into that have been exceptionally dysfunctional, that, we in a big organization should know what they're doing, etc. Now, when I talk about this, Brisbane 2032 is actually one of the most exceptional teams I've ever stepped foot in. And the way that they operate is probably like nothing I've ever seen before. And in a really positive way. The team is they are some of the most incredible individuals. Despite that, they also work incredibly well together in a really beautifully respectful way. But there have been teams that I've walked into that is not the case and that they were there to eat each other alive. And so I think that, when you get presented with opportunities, particularly in leadership, it's important to interview the employer and to unpack what they're saying and to look at some of the nuances of that. Because just because a place is bigger, just because the role is larger, it doesn't mean you're getting a better offering or outcome. And it's got to be the right place and it's got to have the right leadership, for it to be somewhere you'll stay.
Yeah. And I think for the listeners, something you said there, where nobody like when you go into these roles, you might not necessarily know everything, and you don't. And that's the whole point of growth and learning is when you're starting a business, you're not going to know everything.
No.
Even, some of the big companies that you're looking at, they don't know.
No, that's right.
Specific things that are going on in their business. They don't know how to pivot, to shift. It's all a huge learning process.
Absolutely. And I think it's just about being prepared to be flexible.
Yeah. And being open and innovative to learning new things and growing. And it's going to be uncomfortable.
And try something new.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. So the last question, final question is what I ask all the guests. So if there's somebody watching right now that might be starting a business, they might be a woman going into a leadership role, they might be, somebody that's building something, what's the one piece of advice that you would give them?
One thing you need to remind yourself on a regular basis is that, and I remind myself all the time, is I can do hard things. Things will inevitably be hard, but you need to understand that you can do them. There is nothing that's impossible. Just because it's difficult doesn't make it impossible. You'll get there in some way, but just reminding yourself that you can do hard things is really important.
Amazing. I love that. Awesome. So if you got value from this episode, make sure you're subscribed to the podcast because we release conversations like this every single week. Cool. So where can the people find you?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very responsive. So just find me on LinkedIn. And yeah, that's where I am.
Yep. And we'll link that down below for you guys if you want to follow along in Dominique's journey. Cool. Thanks, guys. Bye.